The ZX Spectrum was the follow-up and a huge improvement over the monochromatic ZX81, and Portuguese people were always receptive to technological advances. So the ZX Spectrum was a big opportunity for families to have a computer in their own houses, cause its price was really attractive and everyone had already a cassette player laying around at home. As opposite to the UK and other European countries, Portugal didn't have back then any kind of fiscal control that could protect the intellectual properties of software creators. So it was a huge deal for local electronics and computer dealers to grab the latest hits coming from the United Kingdom and Spain and make tons of copies to be sold really cheap, beginning with a simple and generic cover with the name of the shop front and center and the game's title on the spine of the case. I recall this awkward moment when I was about to play 1984's Bruce Lee and, instead of that typical loading sounds, I got this! The fuss was so huge behind the counter that this kind of mistakes could easily happen. Later, cassette duplication would become more and more professional, with full color covers and even Portuguese instructions or just a basic resume describing the game. Usually, these would cost somewhere around 1 and 2 euros and a perfectly normal practice till early 90s. Few saw this video game business as a huge opportunity to make money, but the ones that really had that vision of things to come made a fortune overnight. I recall this one place that had this wall filled with double-deck duplicators, and while we waited for the copy to finish, we could test the latest hits that would be running on a couple of ZX Spectrums. This practice would later evolve to the Amiga, and those shops needed to keep up with the evolution. I began to suspect that something wasn't right when I started to buy British and Spanish magazines, and ended up realizing that most games were available in cardboard boxes, and I recall thinking that I was being cheated in some way. So my attitude towards that situation was to go to one of my local vendors, select a game, take it home, make a copy, and in the next day return it saying that it didn't work, and then bring the one that I really wanted. Was I stopping piracy by doing that? Not at all, but in my head I was teaching a lesson to those guys for selling cheap alternatives to those gorgeous looking boxes available in other countries. Obviously that this wasn't at all a Spectrum-only issue. This was a common practice also for other home computers from the 80s, the ones that had the biggest fan base in Portugal, like the Commodore 64 and later the Amiga. Portuguese Anti-Piracy Law 109 was finally introduced in August of 1991. The crime of selling pirated video games would be, from that moment on, punished with a 3-year incarceration, and the establishment could even be permanently closed down. So, electronics and computer stores owners that used to make copies to be sold at much lower prices, as low as 75 cents, had to start selling originals. Suddenly, video games were too expensive for most wallets. As you know, and as I already mentioned in pixelthing's episode 62, piracy wasn't just placing a tape on the cassette player and make a copy, if you had a very expensive double-deck system, obviously. There were also amateur radio hobbyists that were also into video games and generous enough to share games with their neighbors through the air, just like a normal radio station that we could tune in and record. Piracy was also a huge problem in Spain, so Spanish publisher Vegh Software came up with a well-received anti-piracy campaign that would allow gamers to get brand new and original titles for a fraction of the price, eradicating almost completely piracy in the Iberian Peninsula. pixelthing's episode 49 tells this exact story, so feel free to check that one out. Back then at school it was really easy to find colleagues that also had a Spectrum and from whom we could borrow some games to make our own 60 or even 90-minute compilation of games. Others would also bring newspaper pieces with the latest tips and tricks to help us in those more difficult levels. The famous pokes would also offer special features in-game like, for instance, unlimited energy or infinite lives. I remember drawing some maps to help my friends find their way through those maze-like levels and pointing out the exact spot of those scattered special items so that they would not waste precious time searching for those. This was how we shared the information in an offline era like the 80s, so I could say that the Spectrum brought people together and a true community spirit was built. So, to conclude, the ZX Spectrum was the responsible for this passion of mine for video games and for many friendships that endure till this present day.